What's up, Cosmetic family?
Thanks for joining us on the Cosmetic Podcast.
Cosmetics mean being a person or thing that gives rise to a phenomenon that is dynamic or energizing.
We're tackling the topics and telling the truth.
Hey, I'm Keith Fenson.
And I'm Rodrigo Ross.
Today we're talking about in the air.
That was my air sound.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
You got a lot of air. Yes.
See?
We're talking about environmental injustice community.
Yeah.
You know what that's all about?
Yes. And well, I do, right? But it's a fairly new concept to me. I'm going to be very transparent here.
Okay.
Right when I really dug in and started getting into the DEI space, this whole idea of environmental injustice and environmental racism became really interesting to me because, quite frankly, I didn't know it was a thing. And it's wow. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it's been around for a while. So the term environmental justice, that emerged back in the 1950s from a study.
Well, that's why I didn't know about it, because that's mine.
Just a couple years.
Hey.
I'm sorry, we weren't supposed to go there. Forgive me, Cosmetic family. So, environmental justice, it emerged back in the 1950s from this study from the federal government about bulk placement of hazardous waste. And most of these sites were normally in African American communities. And so when you say it's fairly new, but you think back to you when you grew up in New York, you know, when you went around the block.
Yes, indeed.
Did you not see that or not?
I did. And, you know, I attributed it then to that was the nuance of the neighborhood, right? It just didn't occur to me that it was something that was intentional or systemic, or that there were certain areas that were targeted. You know, as I began to dig deeper around the subject matter, there's data and evidence to show that very much how redlining worked to keep, you know, Black people out of certain neighborhoods. Environmental racism works the same way in inserting some of these toxic physical environments into certain communities. And so now that I look back, right, hindsight, it's like, wow, I do remember those kinds of things being present in my community. Yeah,
for me, just from this factory pollution, like I grew up in Dale's Home in Portsmouth, Virginia, and you know when you use soap every day, and it got a lot of smelling good to it.
Well, I would think that would smell good, right?
Well, I tell you this, I don't know what goes into making of soap, but I know for the 10 years of my life, the community that I grew up in, and what they call the soap factory on the other side of the highway, the stench that came out of that right there
was not soapy.
That was not soapy.
Wow.
At all.
Wow. So I can imagine that if it didn't smell good, then there's probably some certain level of irritant or pollutant. And so for 10 years, you were breathing that.
And it was in that community, right? And so why wasn't this factory in someplace else?
Right.
And it was next to, I wasn't even the closest community to it. It was next to another project, a more lower income community right there, where you got all this toxic waste that is being, flown into the air.
You know, there is, I was doing some research, right? And there are like 10 examples. There are 10 things that a person could look out for to kind of discern, or at least begin to ask questions about whether environmental racism is at play. And one of the ones that I saw in that data that was really shocking to me is when you see these kinds of physical spaces with pollutants and irritants or garbage or illegal dumping or what have you pop up in places that were inhabited by Black and brown people before, right? Because, I was under the assumption that, maybe because of low-cost housing, or maybe because of the way that a neighborhood was structured, that those things existed and then the houses came. But very many times, the houses and stuff were there, and the folks went and dumped that stuff into neighborhoods. And why is that okay in certain neighborhoods and not others? And why, if those people make a fuss about it, as opposed to people who live in a different neighborhood with, say, a higher tax bracket or taxable income on their homes, why do their voices resonate more?
Right.
Like this whole environmental racism thing is really intriguing to me.
Yeah, because it has a lot of impact. It's some even link it to mental health as well. There was a study back in 2005 that was published in the Journal of Health and Social Behavior, and it found that perceived exposure can affect the mental well-being of communities of color.
Yeah, I believe that.
And so when you start to look around some of these communities where you got all this toxic waste and all that stuff built up around, again, you do see it in communities of color. And when you just look at that environment, you have a lot that goes along with that. And mental health is one of those.
And I can imagine that, like, this is what you have to look at every day. This is what you have to smell every day. This is what your children, if you have any, or your family members are in every day. What about the instances of people getting sick, of people having asthma, of there being adverse health effects? That all affects your mental health, being under this amount of stress, because it's like, who's sick now? Can I drink the water? What's going on in my home? What's going on in my yard? Like, I absolutely can see where your mental health would be impacted from living in an environment like that.
One of the things that I found in the research was that even the temperatures are higher.
I saw that. like, how is that possible that it's hot? So does that go with, environmental? It's wow.
Well, it goes back. So NPR, they did a study of 108 urban areas nationwide.
Yep.
And what they saw is that these were formerly red line neighborhoods. Nearly every city that was studied was hotter than another area. And it's like the difference was as high as 13 degrees in some places.
Hold on. So you mean in certain parts of town, it could be, say, a nice, balmy, wonderful 80 degrees, and then a couple of blocks over, it's 93 degrees?
That's what some of the research shows.
That's, wow. Wow. Well, you know what? It did always feel hotter in my neighborhood, now that I think about it.
Well, that's because part of it is that it's more concrete in those areas.
Well, that part too.
So when you talk about more concrete there's probably less parks in that area.
Yeah,
when you think about
air circulation.
High tax areas, they have the green spaces, they have the parks there, and and there goes the difference there.
And people, when I really started digging into the subject matter and started talking about it, people seem to think, these are things that happened a long, long, long time ago. This stuff doesn't exist nowadays. And that is not correct, right?
Correct, right.
But I will say that because more people are aware of environmental injustice and environmental racism, now when they're seeking to rectify and find solutions, they're way better, or they're much more in tune with finding these equitable, long-term, sustainable, really impactful solutions. So have you ever heard of the Deadwood community here in Dallas?
No, I haven't. Tell me about that one.
Yeah, so the Deadwood community was a primarily low-income Black community here in Dallas. Folks owned their homes, really modest homes, but people were proud, right? Mm-hmm. Proud of their homes. It was very much a community. Everyone knew everyone. Your grandmama could fuss at the neighborhood kids and vice versa and all that, right?
Yep, been there.
And so there was a patch of land in the Deadwood community that people started dumping on. And it seems as though once that first little bit of illegal dumping happened, it became a free-for-all. And so not only was there dumping from individuals, there were major companies that were illegally dumping toxic materials like shingles from roofing projects, and all kinds of things ended up right here in these folks' neighborhood. And it became, they had increased incidences of illness and death and cancer. Like the number of people in that community who were experiencing, health related issues. Mm-hmm. And they, for years and years, they tried to get this thing removed. They tried to get folks to come out and find the companies that were participating in this mountain, this pile of trash and whatever, just eclipsed the neighborhood. It just became tall as buildings, and people had to live like this. They talked of one time there was a fire that burned for months. Months, because it was just toxic material, just slow simmering and burning, and it was a horrible thing. Eventually, quite recently, they did get this taken care of, and now in its place is something called the Dallas Audubon Center.
Yes.
Dallas Audubon Center, which is an amazing, if you go to this, it's a nature preserve kind of site. And if you go to this site, you would never in a million years believe that just a few years ago, it was this toxic waste dump. However, it still has some challenges, right? And so do people know it's there? Do the people in the community have access to it? How are they telling the story about why this place exists? What's the backstory behind the Audubon Center? And many people are still like, we're excited and we're glad that the Audubon Center is here, but we can't forget why this place exists, because these kinds of scenarios are continuing to happen around the city. But it took generations of people to fight in Deepwood to get rid of what was called Shingle Mountain.
Yeah, I heard about the Shingle Mountains, but some of that is that they say that it's cheaper for corporations to pollute communities of colors.
Why do you think that is?
Well, they said the research that in these corporations, they get these fines. And so the fines, what they saw was that the fines were lower when you talk about in communities of color versus other communities right there. Wow. And so, corporations, they probably make enough money in some cases. And so therefore they take a fine.
They just budget that fine in, huh? Wow.
I know. I mean, so that's pretty amazing that, a company that would do something like that. I mean, seemingly you would want to do the right thing to make sure communities are cleaned up.
Yeah.
But, we have to do our parts in it also, in that we got to help, how do we help the communities to be able to raise their voice to a place that they can start cleaning up the communities? Back in Los Angeles, folks were able to raise their voice in such a way, and Los Angeles want to step up to the plate. One of the things that they did in some of the communities there was that they began to put more trees in that space. We were talking earlier about, areas being hotter, about 13 degrees hotter than some areas. But Los Angeles, they hired someone to be able to lead this effort to be able to put more shade in those spaces so that it can have some cooler spaces, because, probably in some ways quite naturally couldn't take out the concrete, I guess, to put in parks. But this was their one step to be able to do, is that put trees into place. Yeah,
I mean, there is definitely a power and progress that happens when people organize around this. Just think, a couple of years ago, what was the hot topic that everyone was hearing about? Flint. Right? And the water crisis in Flint, and the fact that this thing had gone unchecked for so many years. But it was when people organized and when they were garnering support across the nation. I mean, they were having rallies and marches and people really speaking out against it all over the country, not just in Flint, Michigan. And as a result, there have been settlements for families who have had generations of health challenges based on living in Flint and consuming the water. They've totally replaced most of the piping system in the entire town. Like, there are some things that happen when people get together and organize and get on one accord to speak out against, very much how you would do that for any other kind of injustice, right? Environmental injustice is definitely one of those things where people need to come together and speak out.
Yeah, I mean, we got to be able to help people to amplify their voices for, and we, those who have some larger voices in some spaces, got to be able to reach out and help some of the vulnerable communities out there. Part of that is coming in and helping with, some education in there to be able to point out those things. Some of that comes into, making sure simple things that our yards are kept up, and so that, they're not overgrown. And, one of the great things about the YMCA and some of our service groups that we have, they go into the community and help with these different projects. Here locally, I was talking to a funder, and he wasn't involved in homelessness, but he got involved because he had an interest on cleaning up the Trinity River here in Dallas.
Wow.
And so what was happening was that they went down, did this big project, cleaning up. wow, nice and pretty. Well, next week, all of a sudden, all this stuff back again.
Right back, yeah.
And it was like, well, where in the world is this coming from? And so it began to reach out and talk to some people. And what was happening was individuals who were homeless, they were living under the different bridges, and their carts and stuff, or clothing, it would just spill over into the Trinity River and just cause all this backup. Yeah. And so he got involved with homelessness to be able to help out with that. But that came as a result of him, being invested into the environmental portion of that. And so now he's doing the environmental part and he's doing homelessness. So kudos to him for just reaching out to be able to help some different areas and staying with it long term.
That reminds me, I'm going to show you how smart I am right now. So that reminds me of a quote from Desmond Tutu, who said that you can pick people out of the river, but at some point you gotta go upstream and figure out why they're falling in, right? And so he did just that, and because he could have organized, right? Like he could have easily said, okay, well, we'll clean it up again. But this environmental injustice and environmental racism is very much like other things where you gotta figure out at a systems level, why does this keep happening? And help people get at that and change the system so that it's good for them, it's good potentially for their other family members, their children, their grandchildren. Like there's some long-term sustainable change or eradication. Imagine that, right? Eradication of the problem.
Right. So how do we eliminate homelessness? We get
That's a good question. It's enough podcast.
Well, we give people houses, right?
Well, that part.
Yeah. So now people have a place to live. So, but we got to be able to go into our communities. YMCAs, other nonprofits out there who are out there impacting communities. Let's think about how, from an environmental standpoint, that we can change this around, help people to gain a voice, to be able to speak out, helping them to know, what are the, because sometimes when you see a problem, it just becomes part of the landscape, and it's just there.
Right.
Well, it's always been dirty.
Blind.
Yeah. And so therefore that's how it stays.
Yeah.
And so, but we need, you have the big mamas of the neighborhoods, and we got to listen to big mama.
You got to listen
and be able to
and use strategies that already exist. So it's making me think of a national strategy that we had in the Y called Togetherhood, right? Okay. Where communities, the Y kind of serves as the backbone, so to speak, just to really convene and hold space and help people organize and let the people who live in that community decide what it is that they want to tackle, and they do it together with their neighborhoods, with their neighbors in their neighborhoods. And so there have been so many places in this country who have used this togetherhood concept, and it's out there. It's a structured, it's a formal kind of strategy to really, it's not about us coming in and always having the answer and us coming in and quote unquote saving a community, but it is very much about us being a partner and being a neighbor and just helping people live the best version of themselves. So I might have to pull that togetherhood strategy and dust it off and see how it applies to environmental injustices.
Well, when you think about all our YMCAs across the country, we have 900 represented out there. What if we were able to just get one volunteer group from each of those Ys to be able to go into a community? And the thing is that you don't have to take on all, 250 blocks, right?
Right.
It's just that one block. Well, let's start there and begin to build out from there, from that point right there. We're going to start at our properties first and foremost to make sure that our properties are a beacon, a light for that community right there. And then we'll begin to, to build out from there. How do we help our neighbors to make sure that our communities are cleaned up? How do we help our neighbors to be educated, to provide information, the content? How do we be that bridge to the city to help bring the city government together along with the residents of the community to be able to give voice? I'm going to give props to my man, Councilmember Casey Thomas, District 3, Oak Cliff community here in the Dallas Y, because Casey is all about making sure that the community is cleaned up. When I was working with him on a project, Revitalize Redbird, we were talking about code enforcement, and when those neighbors spoke about something that was going on in the community, Casey was on the phone. Hey, here's the number that you call.
Yeah.
If they couldn't get through, he was calling them personally to make sure Coles was coming out. And next thing you know, Cole was out and, making sure things were in place.
Yeah.
But you need voices like your council members to be able to advocate for you, for their community. That's what they're there for.
Yeah.
I mean, you elected them in order to do those things right there.
Yeah.
And so we got to put some of these strategies together in order to be able to change our communities, because there's no reason for junk just to be in a community.
Yeah, and be innovative, right? And hold the people and the businesses and the partners in the community accountable to being innovative with you. So what if, right, you have a YMCA or any other kind of organization that's building a new structure or looking to do some community development, some infrastructure development in your community, and they started thinking, you know what, not only will we just build this particular building, which will absolutely enhance the community, we're going to turn the entire block into a hotspot, or we're going to make sure that every property that touches ours has upgraded landscaping or lighting or whatever. Like, they begin to think in a much more family oriented way, if that makes sense.
Yep.
And if all of the businesses and entities started doing that, then those, like you said, that ripple effect happens, and the ripples will go out and they will begin to touch, and the entire community will be lifted up.
Yeah, we got to be able to step up to the plate to be able to do that. So, Cosmetic family who are listening out there right now, what is it that you can do to help us prevent this environmental injustice? How do we make our communities that much more better?
Yeah, excited to hear what you guys come up with, and thank you for listening to Cosmetic.
Hey, where we're tackling topics and telling the truth.
Subscribe and listen to us weekly.
Hey, and don't be shy. Give us a 5-star review.
Five stars?
5 stars.
5 stars.
Yes.
And as always,
Be dynamic.
be phenomenal.
Be cosmetic.